This podcast is brought to you by Humans, the next generation HRIS supporting distributed organizations globally.
Okay, Thomas, thanks very much for being around today. It's very special. We can jump straight in. I'll let you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you, who you are, and what you love.
Sure. So I'm Thomas. I'm the VP of People and Talent at a company called Juro. We're about 100 people strong contract automation platform. I've joined the company just as the pandemic was kicking off, so about 4 years. Came into that people aspect of the role actually quite by accident, I would say. So my background is in talent acquisition and recruiting. I've been in the UK for about 6-7 years and also kind of stumbled into HR generally. So there's a lot of stumbling basically in the last 10 or so years. Studied psychology originally and then kind of went into internships and kind of cascaded from there. And yeah, today my role basically encompasses the entire kind of employee experience at that startup, and the way that I typically try to explain it to people at like a family gathering or so, like my CEO builds the product and I help my CEO build the company itself as if it were a product itself, and really loving doing that at the moment, even though it comes with a ton of challenges.
Amazing, and we're going to cover quite a few of those challenges today, so I'm really excited. I mean, you mentioned that you bumped into this, right? I'm curious now, why did you decide to stay into it? Like, what got you excited about the people space, the HR space, and again, kind of talent world more broadly?
I ask myself that question all the time, but actually, because the thing that got me excited originally is I realized, I think, quite early on, this was with my previous company where I had to, apart from just the hiring of people, which was quite bread and butter, and it's it's quite they're all their own projects, every role, but it's still in a way a bit repetitive. But then I had an opportunity to lead the US expansion for my previous company, and I really enjoyed the kind of steps plan creation, the like working with various stakeholders in order to kind of get that project to completion. And because it was somewhere at the intersection between kind of operations growth, but also kind of people setup, I thought, could I do more of that? And then this opportunity at Juro to originally be a people and talent lead came along. And that just kind of spiraled from there. So like today, my role is very much probably like 70-30 split between kind of overseeing kind of people, meaning the kind of building of the core product that we have, which is the deal between employee and employer, and then 30% on growing or overseeing the growing of the company just in terms of people and headcount. And I've really throughout that never once not enjoyed the idea of actually taking something that doesn't exist yet or something that exists in a version 1 and iterating on it or making it better, knowing that the end user or the employee is the one who should ideally benefit from that. So actually the kind of product management type aspect of it is the thing that I enjoy the most, and I feel it's quite a new approach from sort of, as I understand and kind of speak with other people leaders that's quite new to the industry as a kind of way of thinking. But I've never seen anything
a little bit more your technical kind of background and view into
exactly, and I've never known anything else, right? I've never I basically came into this not ever having a CPO on top of me or anybody that sort of I could take experience from, let's say, like the last 25 years where there might be a completely different mindset from. So in a way, a thing that I've started to see as a strength of mine is that I come at pretty much everything I do in the space with first principles that means that I have a lack of experience in some ways, but also I feel that it frees me from the sort of constraint of thinking about how things always have been done. Right, so like people have always done a 9-box grid, for example, to assess people, and I might arrive at that conclusion, I might not, but that's how at Juro we've been able to build a brand, I think, that feels very distinctly us, and that's what we win, very luckily, like awards for. That's what, candidates who apply, like consistently call out in the way that we do job ads and the way that we present ourselves. And I think that's really a product of coming into sort of this company product that, when I joined at 15 people was already quite mature, I would say, but still, very raw, unpolished, and basically being able to tinker with it. And that's really cool. And I'm really enjoying seeing that pay off.
A curiosity right there, you mentioned the way you are approaching this is a little bit different, something that you've not seen or experienced in the past. How do you go about elevating yourself, upskilling yourself, like, making sure that, maybe there are not lots of people that you can learn from in certain areas specifically. So how do you approach that?
So it depends a little bit on what the thing is that I'm trying to focus on. So let me give you a recent example. Right now, a thing that's really at the kind of front of mind is looking at this kind of core relationship between pay, performance, and progression. At Juro, we call that the kind of 3P triangle. That's because that is really the core employee exchange of value. Right? You do work in exchange for getting money and being able to, grow professionally. And, there's a ton of like frameworks and ways of doing that and designing it. But for me, it was important to, view that in the first instance as, additional input or like resource that I could have. But really what I wanted to come up with first is, think about how would I do this? And then go out into community roundtables that luckily through our investors, I've got access to talk with people that have been in the industry for like 30 years, 20 years, people that are sort of roughly at the same stage as me, and just kind of ask them like, how do you do it? How have you done it, etc. That is the first kind of input. The second one is just looking at product principles and seeing, well, how, if a product we're trying to create a new feature, and there is, yes, a way that like lots of other companies have built this, like how would you actually go about that? Those two inputs I find have helped me quite a lot to kind of come up with an idea that's sort of a mixture of I've worked on this myself first, I've thought it through, but then also I don't need to reinvent the wheel and I don't need to, just completely go out there and create something that, completely flips the table on everything. I've always, said, I don't want to be a pioneer really in anything. I don't want to redo the entire way that like people has ever been done. I think just by the way that like I'm doing it with kind of a mixture of my own approach and if I had no idea but I had to do this, how would I do it? I'm already creating something that feels like new, fresh, and most importantly, uniquely Juro, and something that lets our employees move faster, which is ultimately the end goal of what we're trying to achieve with anything we put out.
How do you think about what is Juro? Like, is there kind of a definition that you crafted? Was something that was there when you joined? Is something that's coming from the founders? Maybe you can elaborate on the components.
So we think of this as kind of two separate but closely connected things, right? There's Juro, the platform, right? The contract automation platform that exists to help the world agree faster. And that is, one kind of value proposition because it goes out to our customers. The other one is Juro, kind of the company. Right? And that is a slightly kind of different proposition where when companies talk about like EVP, employee value proposition, that's typically what companies mean, right? It's like, what is this company here for, right? I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh, we figured that out and we've got a single sentence that tells you exactly like what Juro is. That's a thing that I'm still going to tackle and where I'm still going to go. But we're trying to let the core values and principles that we've created, and those have always been there. So when I joined, there was a core set of beliefs that I've really just taken, run with, and expanded upon. Most values, they tend to be not very concrete. So like what specific behaviors, etc., do we think are good? So I've expanded that. But then just seeding that throughout, like how do we do pay? What does our career framework look like? do we mandate anybody to come in the office or not? And those things, without even like specifying a single sentence or like a nice little paragraph that you can market, it gives people a sense that, you know, the thing that Juro is quite a unified thing. The three things that people have told us consistently they think, you know, Juro is like, one, very mature for its stage. In other words, you know, this company has its shit together. Second one being, this company genuinely thinks deeply about, you know, the things that it does and the solutions that it puts out. And number three, they approach the kind of relationship with employees with care. And, you know, that's interesting. Something that we can run with, something we can expand on. But ultimately, we basically do practical things, and then we kind of look at what comes back. Mm-hmm. And can we form a sense of self through that?
Okay. You mentioned at the beginning something around your 70-30 split. How that changed over time, and is that kind of, you know, changing on a regular basis, let's say based on business priorities or what's happening within the market, within the space? How that works for you?
When I joined, pretty much 80 to 90% was talent, because that's ultimately the problem that I was initially brought in to solve. And, you know, at that point, it was just me and one other team member. So I was very, very hands-on as a leader. And then, you know, as it kind of grew, obviously I got more team members, and I got to hand off a lot of the kind of repeat work to them, to make sure that, you know, when somebody gets hired or a new role opens, that, you know, that's really you know, that just runs. Like, I could, you know, vanish into thin air tomorrow, and, you know, the business would still stand. What that did is it didn't really change so much the things that I did itself. It changed more the level at which I did them. So, for example, a thing that I talk a lot about with, you know, other people leaders, people and talent leaders in the space is, you know, how do you, you know, decide headcount? How do you, you know, get involved into that conversation? Is that the CFO who does it? Is somebody else who does it? And sometimes that gets a little bit difficult. But by, you know, having sort of set up playbooks and structures for my team to follow, that they can do without, you know, everything just going up in flames when I'm gone. That enables me to actually focus on, okay, you know, ahead of the, you know, the new fiscal year, like, what is the value that I can actually add to the business in deciding, like, who we're going to hire, how many, how does that impact our burn, how does that impact our burn multiple, all of these variables. Now, that part has now turned out to be about sort of 30%. So it's more like overseeing talent and helping with the strategic element of, you know, iterating on a hiring roadmap. And the shift has now gone to, okay, we're a company that is between Series B and C, especially now macroeconomic picture. Everybody's kind of switching from, you know, burn it like you mean it to profitability is key. So that comes with a completely new set of challenges, and it means that your value proposition, that core triangle of performance, pay, and progression, needs to adapt. And that is currently where those 70% come from.
What's top of mind for you? 2024, a quarter already done.
Quarter gone, panic. A couple of things. First one is with this kind of very top, these kind of changing top demands that come from like VCs all over this, you know, everybody's heard this that's like listening to this podcast or watching, you know, it's like do more with less, and you know, and suddenly like becoming cash flow positive is like more important. I think sometimes it feels like that is a change that is happening to us rather than a change that we are making an active decision in. And what I'm thinking through quite a lot at the moment is how things that tend to be quite heavily in the background a lot of times, which is, you know, how do you, in an environment where people demand to, you know, have flexibility in where they work from, on one hand, but also, and I'm pretty sure that pretty much the entire knowledge work industry is feeling this distraction from like Slack and emails and too many priorities and this sort of startup ADD that everybody's feeling a little bit. How do you use that to make sure that the things you put out to help people be at their best, have their best uptime, have their best downtime, in order to have the fewest amount of people generate the maximum amount of revenue without anybody burning out. That's the thing that I'm thinking about quite heavily right now. That is the first. The second one being this kind of core triangle that I mentioned about what's the kind of way for us that makes the most sense in what we expect in exchange for how we pay and where we allow people to grow.
Is there anything specific that happened that was like, okay, we experienced this, we need to make sure that this doesn't happen again, or we should be trying something different there? Or is there any concrete examples you have there?
When the pandemic started, a lot of our people were telling us nothing different than most other companies were, which is that we're struggling, it's like burning out. Like what can we do? Now, what I saw most companies did is they kind of jumped to like well-being platforms, etc., and just like put those in place. And for me, that actually was quite an interesting wake-up call, because the way that we approached it was a bit different. We basically just took a little bit of time to understand, okay, well, what is it that actually stresses you out? Is it the being locked in at home personally? Is it just life goes on and there's things that happen that you can't control? Is it, that you're just feeling the ineffectiveness of too many meetings too much? And turns out it's like a mixture of all of things. And all of these have slightly different solutions, right? And yes, offering like a well-being platform or therapy might be one of those solutions, but it's not the be-all and end-all. So in fact, a lot of the things that we were focusing on then, and an approach that I've really taken through the years forward, is really digging very deep into what are the issues and what is the kind of battery of things that will make the most impact. And that is something that, even today, I really try and do, right? We do engagement surveys like every 6 months. One of the key themes from the most recent one was that trust in leadership remains very strong, but actually, as a company, socializing doesn't really seem to be much part of that. That's a very interesting finding, but the question is, well, what's the problem here? Is it that we have a group of team members who just really, really want to meet each other and we're not offering the opportunity to do that? Is it just, you want to meet up on a quarterly or a 6-monthly basis? Just really digging into those problems and then trying to figure out a solution, which, for example, for us can be, budget to organize your own things, making sure that there's a travel budget for a distributed team out there, just getting energy in by organizing another company retreat, which, they all took a backseat in 2023. And we're doing one again in October, and that just injected a lot of energy. Turns out, these things, they obviously add a bit to your burn. They're not super cheap. And you need to be in a fortunate position, which we are, to have enough cash runway and a solid strategy.
Can also be tools used for retention strategy as well.
Exactly. But if you have that, like these things, there wasn't a particular fire anywhere, but there's a lot of these little things that constantly pop up, and the way that we try and prevent them from ballooning into a massive exodus or whatever is by really trying to go deep into the problem and trying to solve them with a bit of a product mindset.
Beautiful. You mentioned that there was this wake-up call during the pandemic. What we've seen, probably starting with the pandemic in the people space, is that things change massively. There was obviously the remote working, and then now the debate, should we go back to the office? And then you see the quiet quitting, and then you see companies scaling super fast, and then you see downsizing, and now the AI's companies, they're again scaling even faster than what we've seen in the pandemic. First of all, what's going on there in the people space? How have you seen the role of people leaders evolving, adjusting, in the last 4 years compared to maybe a little bit earlier than that, pre-pandemic? And also, what's your view perhaps in how the role should evolve going forward as well? A bit of a loaded question, but we'll love your take.
What I think is happening is, I sometimes say same panic, different disco. So what I think fundamentally is happening is actually nothing too different from what has always happened. There's always some kind of trend or some kind of thing. And that means that you as a company need to adapt. Especially like working in a startup, and I always say this when the topic comes up at events, running a startup is a bit like running on sand, if we're honest, right? So you try to like go forward, but suddenly there's something like a pandemic, or a Silicon Valley Bank collapses.
And I remember your thing of camel versus unicorn as well. This may be related to
correct, yeah, right. The idea of do you want to like have hyper growth or sustainable growth, right? Do you want to become a unicorn but also be like a camel that can survive like throughout droughts, the sort of the unicamel approach that we're trying to take with, call it sustainable growth, call it what you want, but that kind of visual. There's always something going on. And the reality is that like for startups, that's deadly. Like that any of these can absolutely sink your ship. And in fact, it has sunk a lot of ships in 2022, 23. So what can you do? There's really only like one thing that you can focus on, and that is organizational health. The WHO has a definition on health, which is actually terrible, which is the absence of sickness. I'm wearing glasses. I'm obviously not healthy according to that definition. A much better one that I like from a book called Healthy No Matter What is that, in principle, bodily health, is the ability to adapt to any of the changes that kind of come into your life, physical, mental, social, etc. Just add the word organizational health in front of that and just change out a couple of the words. Then ultimately a company that survives all of these things, whatever happens in the 2020s or in the 2010s, be it a recession, an inflation, a stagflation, a quiet quitting, which by the way, I don't think is a thing. I think that's a new term for just disengaged employees. I don't think that that's, something new. And if you focus on having a really solid team, and that starts with your central control unit, your leadership team, if you focus on that unit being very well trained in dealing with whatever adversity comes your way, your company is going to be able to weather all of that. Where people leaders come in, and I think where many of them were tested to their utmost with very different circumstances in the last couple of years, is with the round of redundancies. You had these massive waves, and you still have some of them going on, of cutting. Some companies, they cut like 7 times. That obviously wears resilience down massively. And within that, the job of a people leader, I think, has changed heavily from in the 2010s, where it was mainly quote sort of reactive, protect the company, like do the paperwork, make sure that collective consultations, etc., like all those happen, and much more towards a project management type approach, right? Our job, our mission, and my mission as a people leader, I see fundamentally, is make the company grow faster. And if I look at everything through that lens, I am actually freed up from a lot of the constraints that I think are wearing a lot of people down, which is employee happiness being your number one thing. Like if you focus on the happiness or the emotions of other people the entire time, you are gonna burn out. Certainly I would constantly burn out. But if I focus on how we communicate a redundancy, how we communicate this change in like a provide, like whatever it is, will this make the company go faster or will it make it sink? We've seen that, Silicon Valley Bank's collapse was down to an error in communication. Somebody said something to the wrong people at the wrong time and it triggered a bank run. That is what a people leader can prevent, because they are the number one person making the leadership team that does all of that communication do it well or die from infighting.
Beautiful. On this topic of adjusting, adapting, one thing that we notice in particular over the last year, but also now, is there is way more constraints. For example, like people teams were investing a lot more in different activities, initiatives. I want my people to be happy, which is like maybe, happiness should be kind of a product. You want your team to be successful, and if they're successful as a result, they're going to be ultimately kind of happy. How do you operate in this climate? Like, if you have more constraints around the resources, how do you make sure that you can run an effective talent strategy? How do you make sure that you can run, I don't know, your people tech is in the right shape, your acquisition mentioned there, or engagement is in the best possible shape as well? Like, how do you think about that?
I don't think making people happy is our job. I think that if we are doing our job right, people will be quote unquote happy, but I'm not responsible for somebody else's happiness. I got asked that question quite recently, actually, and was surprised when I got a couple of sort of like wide eyes. They're like, "What? Like employee happiness? But you're like the people leader. Like, shouldn't like the people be your utmost concern?" Which turned to a interesting conversation for another day, which is people actually the right term for what we're doing in the way that I'm thinking about it? Because I am there to help the company accelerate. And how do I do it? By helping people work better together. There's 3 ways that I can achieve that. 1, make sure the right people come into the business in the first place. That's talent. 2, building the best value proposition for the company at that time. That's the kind of product management-y approach of people. And 3, making sure that you can take that product and make the people that are using it, your leaders, your managers, your ICs, the most successful with what you have. In essence, people and talent is replicating the entire rest of the company, just on a way smaller scale. Talent is sales and marketing. People is engineering and product, because we're setting the direction and we're also building it. And we're the customer success of the team. Nowhere in there, if you asked any of those teams across the rest of the business, is customer happiness a top priority. Customer happiness is the thing that you want to get out at the end if you're doing the success part right. And that is how we operate at Juro as well. It shows in our ENPS scores and our engagement scores. They're consistently in the 50s and above, right? But that ultimately is the thing that happens when you are doing all of these slightly more hidden, slightly more boring things well. And we make that extremely clear when we bring people in. So you mentioned talent strategy just now. This sense of entitlement, I would say, that often comes with the word startup. People kind of think like, oh, startup, folks, they're like, just doing free beer taps all day.
Startups go massively glorified over the last whatever many years.
Exactly.
I think the expectations very
absolutely right now. Right now, there's a massive reckoning with, oh, it's not all sunshine and roses. I actually am taking a huge risk when I work in a business, but it comes with the trade-off of being able to grow very fast, being able to. If you get equity in your company, you might have a life-changing amount of money in 5 years in the future. We hire for people who understand that is the trade-off in the first place, and that is what will preempt a lot of the issues that you might have down the line by incurring people debt if you hire people with a mindset that isn't going to let them sustainably succeed.
How do you help people understand that and set expectations right? In particular, if someone has not experienced it before, maybe there's some kind of younger people that just approaching the world of work to understand, do I work at a startup, do I work at a large organization? Startup sounds great, sounds fun, I can get proximity to people, but there is lots of hard work related to that as well that maybe sometimes you don't really realize. So how do you set expectations right and enable them?
I'm actually surprised. I found this expectation kind of rethink actually more of an issue with more senior employees, particularly the ones that came up in what I call the sugar rush of the 2010s VC market, where money is free and you do everything. 3 ways. First, we really boil every interview process down to 3 questions. Can this person do the job? Does this person want to do the job? And do we want this person to do the job? In other words, is this person like moving on and joining a startup for the right reasons? So literally in the very first call a talent partner does, we ask these kind of core questions of, what do you expect working in a startup to be like? What do you think are the trade-offs that you're making versus the company? Now, a lot of the people that we interview, they came from startups already. They have a kind of sense, especially now that like a couple of years have passed and like all of these, stumbling blocks, the sand, if you will, like have happened. So it's easier. So that really kind of sets it off to the right spot. I think one of the kind of mistakes that I've made very early on in my career was kind of focusing primarily on can they do the job, and then the other two are sort of kind of off to the side. Like keeping them motivated is our job, which it is to a certain extent, but not not from the get go, and certainly not like throughout the entire time. And I think everybody has realized, especially when you're like 80 people or less, one bad apple or one person who isn't aligned with or completely in opposition potentially to the way that you operate and quote unquote toxic, like they will slow the company down massively. So these are very much like in the same vein. In that regard, when we then have people in, our onboarding sessions focus on very much continuing that theme. Our leadership does onboarding sessions themselves still for pretty much every single area of the business. And the focus there is always on, look, our expectations are very high. Our expectations are clearly defined in our job descriptions, as is what you get out of it if you deliver. But make no mistake, whilst we will always support you through clear expectation setting, helping you prioritize that, you're going to be supported to achieve these. If you don't, this isn't the right company for you. That sometimes comes as a bit of a shock, but people get over that very quickly. And we found that it actually is the number one thing that keeps up urgency, which is kind of a theme that sort of underlies pretty much everything that has happened in the first couple of months of 2024. Everybody keeps talking about like, how do we keep up the urgency? How do we make sure people aren't complacent? Setting the expectations right at the beginning, that's how you make sure that people aren't complacent.
When you mentioned this piece around enabling the leadership team, this is, you mentioned your founders, they're still doing those sessions, but it's not only a responsibility of a founder, responsibility of your CFO, responsibility of your chief commercial officer, chief marketing. Like, what is your role in supporting the leadership team? How do you operate with the leadership team to make sure they are enabled to deliver what you just described?
I've thought about this a lot, particularly in the last 6 months. So I had a bit of a, I'd probably say like a bit of an identity crisis, perhaps, back in October, triggered by something else. But I think I had a period of time where I asked myself kind of the same question, like, what am I actually here to do if I'm not, hiring myself anymore, or, if even the kind of like day-to-day of building like our compensation frameworks or whatever is something that I'm not massively involved in, right? I'm not as hands-on anymore, and I thought like, what am I actually here to do? And I was very lucky that at the time I was working with a leadership coach as well, and we at some point the conversations, I remember this because it's very core memory for me. At some point we talked about what's the point of a chief of staff, because for a while I thought should I go down like a chief of staff role, and he have asked me like, what's the point of a chief of staff? And I was like, well, they're kind of the person that gets the rest of the leadership team together and makes them run smoothly. And he was like, that's kind of sounds like that's the job that you want to do. It's like, yeah, actually that's the job that I want to do. We don't have a COO, we don't have a chief of staff. And that's where it kind of clicked for me that if I want to deliver the maximum value to the company, the number one thing that I can do is be, for lack of a better word, the people partner for the leadership team. And I talked that through with my CEO quite quickly afterwards. And what that turned into was a 6-month exercise, let's say, starting with a leadership offsite. And luckily, by the way, our leadership team is already, I think, working quite well. together. The statistic is more that 8 out of 10 leadership teams are dysfunctional. So bit of a shocking statistic, assuming that those are the people that you want to trust in a crisis, and those folks typically are not actually well in alignment. There was a book that helped quite a lot when I kicked this off. It's called The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni, which is a very nice blueprint on how to align a leadership team. But that turned into a playbook for our SLT. We call it EXCO, Executive Committee. And that's really just the ground rules of, how do we make decisions? How do we do one-to-many communications? What should be sync? What should be async? We basically created this microcosm of, if it can't run in this team, we shouldn't cascade it down to the rest of the company. Because if there's a little bit of daylight between like two execs, CMO and the CTO, for example, it will be absolutely blinding to people who are further down. We cannot afford at a point where it's extremely critical to accelerate really, really fast, and with the additional constraint of being like really cash effective, we need to work like a unit, a little bit like a firefighting unit, right? They train in peacetime to do the things that when you're in actual fire and you need to put out that fire, you do not have time to question, how are we doing these things? Today, we're actually spending 20% of our time, roughly, that we're together as a leadership team, and we're together weekly, monthly. I have one-to-ones with every single C-level and other VP-level leader. We're spending that time on how do we actually operate better together. I would argue, even though it's an indirect effect, that is the number one thing that has actually helped us accelerate.
How do you identify when a leadership team is dysfunctional?
You let them identify it themselves. The good thing is, let me actually take a step back. Why are leadership teams not doing this? If it is, I probably would say, very few people would disagree that, a well-functioning leadership team is imperative to the success of the company. I think there's kind of three reasons for this, but one trumps above all the rest, which is that people kind of assume that once you've made it to the top of the ladder, you should just sort of know how to work really well in a team. Which is absolutely wrong, because not only is that just not true, you're also in a team where nobody does the job of the other person. If you're in a sales team, you've got a bunch of AEs, they know roughly what job they're doing. I will never know in depth what our CTO is doing. I can, talk with him a lot and try to sort of get in depth. But at the end of the day, the CRO and the CTO, they will not ever try, nor should they probably have to, understand exactly what the other one is doing. So because of that, there's sort of this inherent sense, I feel, that investing time, working better as a team, it feels almost like an admission of failure. And then the second thing is, it's very hard to quantify whether this team is is repeating patterns that are unhealthy. The way that we solved that was, in our case, by not reinventing the wheel. That book that I mentioned has just an online test that lets leadership teams rate themselves on the 5 dysfunctions of a team, which is a very typical framework. I don't want to come up with something completely new. I just took something that worked for us. Luckily, our CEO also had talked it through with his kind of CEO kind of group in our investor portfolio. So great, buy-in is already there. And that basically just showed, okay, we're ranking ourselves as not terrible on all of these things, but we're ranking ourselves sort of in the middle. And that was just the starting point for a conversation on, okay, which of these do we think that we're currently weakest at? And it led to us actually talking about, I said earlier, we're kind of working very well together. Turns out we actually agreed that we're working a little too well together. In other words, we weren't engaging in healthy conflict. And that prevented us from making tough decisions quicker, because we just didn't quite want to upset the balance as much. And once we kind of started that conversation and set up a couple of recurring cadences to say, okay, we think this is important to talk about, let's try a couple of frameworks, etc., how to improve that. That's where it kind of snowballs into the future. What we are going to do in, I think, about 3 months, we're just going to retest and see how that has changed. That way you have a very simple way, and we do have a simple way of seeing, okay, how is this team operating? Are we, by our definition, healthy in the green? And are the things that we're doing to improve it making it better? It's a really hacky way to basically take something that feels really, really fuzzy into something that's just quantifiable. And that's often the first step to getting that buy-in.
How's your relationship with your CEO?
It is very good. It has moved through phases. When I've joined Juro in 2020, I was very lucky to get a piece of advice from my former manager, who's still a good friend of mine, to say that in the role that I'm about to step into, where it's people and talent, to make no mistake, my number one person, the one person I need to impress and have a good relationship with is the CEO. Nobody else. Not any other leadership team member, not any of the managers, like none of these people, they all pale in comparison to the CEO. So I really took the time during that interview process to ensure that him and I were on the same wavelength. And that work has very luckily paid off. We, I would say, agree on about 80% of things. And I think a couple of people have said, "Oh, isn't that bad? Maybe it's like groupthink or whatever." I disagree with that point. As long as we disagree maybe on 20% of things, like we wouldn't get anything done if we agreed on like half, and then half we were completely in opposition. It's evolved through time because the demands of me and also my seniority have changed, right? I'm not sitting here as somebody with 10 years in a VP seat. I've got 2 years of VP experience, and that kind of quite like meteoric rise has meant that I've always demanded. I say that very knowingly because it has been something that him and I have talked always very strongly about. Like, I need vulnerability to be part of our relationship, as in that I can tell him when I'm thinking I'm having a bad day, a bad week, when I think I'm not doing this very well. And very, very luckily, he's always understood that. That is the number one reason why I joined Juro, and it's the number one reason why I'm still there. Because I realize, especially through talking with like other people leaders at Mixus, that relationship is not actually that common. And that so many people are constantly having to like swim upstream or like get the ear of the CEO or like get buy-in or whatever. I've never had that problem. The one question I get asked whenever I give a talk is, how do you get buy-in from the person? And my answer is always the same, which is, it feels like you're asking me, oh, I'm in this unhappy marriage. How do I make it work? And the answer is you kind of don't leave if you have the ability to, if you have the like luxury of doing that. My sense is if you do not have a good relationship with your CEO, I don't think you're going to have a good time doing all the things that we've talked about without completely destroying your own well-being in the process.
Wow. Another relationship that I'm seeing solidified in the last probably 6-12 months, or at least emerge a little bit more, was the relationship between the people leader and the finance leader. In particular, going back to the point around cost, compression, budget, things are changing. We need to cut. We need to take measures that are more drastic. Where are we spending money? Where we're not spending money? What's your view on the dynamic, the relationship, and anything that you can share about your experience there?
I'm going to add a third person into the mix, and that is legal. So I said earlier that, because we're a contract automation company, there's a lot of legal, but also because I said earlier that we don't have a COO. That's actually a bit of a lie. We have what we do call COO, which is for us an acronym of company org. So we basically split Juro into these kind of two parts: the customer org, that focuses on building and selling Juro, the platform.
Yep.
And then we've got the company org, which is comprised of people and talent, legal, and finance. Yep. And they kind of focus on building that other product. So in there is exactly as you said, like pretty much like so many things in there, they kind of cross pretty much all three. You think something as simple as payroll. Payroll is kind of at the intersection of like people and also a bit of finance. Sometimes it's owned by one, sometimes it's owned by the other. Equity, weird intersection between all three, because typically your like GC is better at doing share options, like the intricacies of an ESOP scheme. Finance does the kind of submission to the HMRC if it's an EMI scheme, and I'm responsible for deciding the principles of like who should get equity, etc. Because we do not have a COO, the person, the only way that we can make this run smoothly is by working extremely closely together in that triangle. How are we doing that? In our case, we're meeting on a weekly basis to discuss sort of hot button topics. But what we're building alongside is anytime a topic comes up that is kind of co-owned between like two of us or all three of us, we move through a simple exercise, which other people might know as DICE. Some people know it as DASI. It's always kind of the same general idea, which is a driver, there's an approver, a person who contributes, and a person who is informed. Basically, who is the person that the buck stops with? So is equity in principle owned by me and our head of legal supports, or is it the other way around? If you go to things like headcount plan, if you go to things like promotion budgets, right? All of these things that are now like much more under scrutiny because you can't give out money like it's Christmas anymore. The relationship between like our financial manager and me has had to become closer, and the way that we're doing that is by just really giving each other the time of day to understand. Cool, if we are going to set a promotion budget for like next year, what's the best way that we can kind of marry like human principles of what kind of performers should get what with just the realities of like how much can you spend. If we didn't do that, and if we didn't spend like quite a lot of time on talking through these things together, and also if the vibe wasn't right, for lack of a better word, it would consistently be this thing of like, I'm saying one thing and I'm trying to be the voice of the person or the people. The other was like, no, you can't because, you can't afford it. Again, adds daylight between two people who should actually just figure this out behind closed doors amongst themselves and try to find common ground and engage in healthy conflict. As opposed to this kind of like being a huge infighting. For us, luckily, that's worked that way quite well.
Amazing. When you look at team composition in 2024 specifically, is there anything that should change? Anything that you would do kind of a little bit different compared to what you've seen or you have done, what you've seen done in the past? How do you approach that?
In leadership team composition? Or
I would say we can start with leadership, and then if you want to go broader, very happy to touch on that as well.
So in leadership team composition, I've noticed one quite interesting trend, which is that the relative importance of very tenured leaders has become relatively less important. So what I mean by that is the profiles that I've kind of seen succeeding more is these kind of slightly younger up-and-comer type profiles that are on kind of a fast growth trajectory. Now, I don't have a hypothesis on like why that is. I would probably, if I had to venture, I guess, I would probably say it has something to do, right? Has something to do maybe to do with money, but probably it also has something to do with the fact that everything in the last couple of years has just kind of changed, and it continues to change, right? You don't want to make huge decisions that you're going to be stuck to forever in the middle of still like ongoing global crises. We've still got like 2 wars going on. The recession hasn't really stopped, and the pandemic is sort of still like ongoing, even though nobody cares anymore. And I think the kind of mindset that create successful leadership teams has changed a bit from, person has like seen and done everything before towards this kind of slightly younger mindset. That's the first change that I've seen. The second one is this change that I would probably say is sort of your FTX Coinbase change, which is away from people who are just really good at selling the dream and grinding and like talking about everything, to people who perhaps are a little bit more boring, perhaps a little bit more cerebral, but they really know their way around a P&L. They really know a way around a balance sheet. Now, especially in the VC market, I am seeing that become a way stronger currency, and that includes people leaders. A people leader today who has a sense of the rest of the business. They have a way around what is What are like MQLs, SQLs? Like, what are the priorities of the CRO and the CTO?
I love that.
Right? That, like, I don't think you can do your job well if you don't fundamentally understand what those folks are trying to achieve, because otherwise you can like cry foul as much as you want about how you're not getting buy-in, but you're not making an attempt to understand like where those people are trying to go, and the fact that where you are is underneath them. You're the foundation lifting them up. You're not somewhere to the side like trying to do your little well-being program, like not to minimize the power of those things. But I found that like those things off to the side, they typically are slightly lazy, well meant, but slightly lazy, not introspective ways of trying to improve things. And a people leader who has that realization and actually has a much more commercial mindset, that by the way includes all the other teams as well, CTOs, etc., those create a more winning composition in leadership teams, I found.
We covered a lot of ground today, and it's been an incredible conversation. Do you have any piece of advice for people that are listening, leaders that are listening, that you would want to share?
Think about how you are spending your time. Are you currently feeling overwhelmed from trying to do everything all at once? And I would look at that list and say, what are the top 3 things that currently make the most impact on the company's growth? It's a very simple question, and it feels like almost basic when I say it, but I have spent, from personal experience, too much time trying to do too many things at once, because the role of people is way less defined than other roles are. It's because we're just behind in terms of like the development of the entire function. Sales, product, they've had like a decade ahead of us in figuring this out. We're teenagers compared to them. And the best way that you can start, and the way that I have started finding a sense of balance at my work, is really trying to figure out, well, how am I going to actually contribute? How am I actually going to show my worth to this company continuously by doing like X things, right? For us, I always have my 3 priorities like written out. It's very recent things. I didn't always used to do that. I'm not a productivity guru, but that is the one thing that I hear from people. The word overwhelmed is in everybody's mouth. Every single mix, every single networking event that I go to, every single dinner, like everybody's feeling this sense of overwhelmedness, and I can't blame folks, because there is just a lot that kind of comes your way all the time. But also, this is the number one opportunity to check in and have perhaps a little bit of an identity crisis like I did, and say like, well, what am I actually here to provide value for? Narrow that down and, see if, your boss agrees with it. I think we need to fix, or at least get a better sense of what is our function for. And there's so many great thinkers out there. Jessica Swan is one. There's like many great other folks who are basically at the forefront of trying to redefine what it means to be a people leader. And I think now is a great time to start thinking about what that means in your company. Does your company still see you as a cost center? Does it see you as like the support function? Does it see you as the one that's responsible for everybody's happiness? And if the answer to any of those is, maybe they do, but I don't, now is probably a really good time to reevaluate that.
You touched on a few resources already, which is very helpful. Anything else that comes to mind that you would want to share?
A book that I'm reading at the moment that I found immensely helpful in getting started on that kind of journey of managing your own time and priorities better is one that actually came out very recently. It's called Uptime by Laura May Martin. She is the I'll get this wrong, exec productivity advisor at Google. Okay. So 2 things. One, only Google could come up with that with that job title. It probably doesn't exist anywhere else. But her background is super interesting. She used to be a salesperson who just was really, really good with handling her own time. And eventually people started taking note, and they started asking her about, it's like, how are you so on top of things all the time? And that ultimately turned into a job, and that job turned into a book. And I am not an avid reader of nonfiction because I get so many ideas from stuff that I then don't know what to do with, and just like overwhelms me a little bit. Especially because like I'm, work like 9-10 hours a day, typically more like 9, because I try to find good balance, and I don't want to like sink more into work afterwards. But this has very recently made a radical change to how I see my own time as the most important currency that I have. It's made me also change the way that I see our exec ops specialist in our team. In other companies, that's called an exec assistant, but she is ultimately the one responsible for managing the most valuable resource an exec has, which is their time, and trying to make my calendar reflect the 3 priorities that I have, and making sure that it's extremely clear what else is a distraction. I find that that book has a very simple and straightforward and practical way of making those changes. And I would probably say, within a week of reading that, I've, found a much better approach. We'll see if it lasts, but I found a much better approach to how I do things. So, if there was like one recommendation of resources, that one's been absolutely excellent.
Confident people will find it useful. Thomas, where people can connect with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very loud and very mouthy on there. I'm also currently looking for people partners. So, shout out anybody listening who's looking. Still taking applications. But that's the number one place where you find me. I'm also in quite a lot of people communities on Slack, etc. I'm not a huge Twitter or Threads or TikTok user. So LinkedIn is where you find me under, I think, _T Forstner.
Thomas, thanks very much. This was beautiful. Massively appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.